Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. In the late 1990s, America was gripped by fear over rising youth violence. News headlines warned of a new generation of dangerous teenagers, and politicians responded with tougher laws aimed at punishment rather than rehabilitation. It was within this climate that the case of Lionel Tate emerged, a case that would permanently alter how the nation viewed juvenile crime and sentencing. Lionel Tate was only 12 years old when the crime occurred. At an age when most children were still in middle school, his life became entangled with the adult criminal justice system. Prosecutors chose to try him as an adult, a legal option that existed in several states at the time. The decision alone shocked many Americans. Never before had such a young defendant faced the same legal consequences as a fully grown adult, including the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The courtroom proceedings revealed a disturbing collision between youth and punishment. Tate sat at the defense table physically small, surrounded by adults, lawyers, judges, and prosecutors, who spoke in the language of statutes and sentencing guidelines. The jury was asked to consider the facts of the crime, but also to apply laws that made little distinction between a child and an adult offender. When the verdict came back guilty and the sentence of life without parole was imposed, the reaction was immediate and intense. Across the country, people struggled to understand how a child could be condemned to die in prison. Supporters of the sentence argued that the severity of the crime demanded accountability, regardless of age. They believed justice for victims must come first, and that harsh punishment would deter other juveniles from committing serious crimes. But critics saw something far more troubling: a justice system that treated adolescents as irrelevant. Child development experts pointed out that teenagers lack mature judgment, impulse control, and the ability to fully grasp long-term consequences, factors that were largely ignored in court. This was not just about one boy or one crime. It was about a system that, during a moment of fear, chose punishment over possibility. Lionel Tate's sentence became a symbol of how quickly childhood could be erased by the law, and how a single decision in a courtroom could spark a debate that would reach the highest courts in the country. As news of Lionel Tate's life without parole sentence spread, the case quickly moved beyond the courtroom and into the national spotlight. Media outlets, legal scholars, and advocacy groups began asking the same question: how could a child be punished in a way that even many adults would never face? The sentence did not just shock the public. It forced America to confront uncomfortable realities about fear-driven policy and the limits of justice when applied to juveniles. At the heart of the debate was the science of adolescent development. Psychologists and neuroscientists explained that teenage brains are still forming, particularly in areas responsible for impulse control, judgment, and understanding long-term consequences. These findings challenge the assumption that juveniles possess the same moral and cognitive capacity as adults. In Tate's case, critics argued that the legal system had ignored these realities, treating a 12-year-old as if he were fully developed and beyond redemption. Legal experts also scrutinized the laws that allowed such sentencing. During the 1990s, many states expanded statutes that made it easier to try juveniles as adults, largely in response to public anxiety about youth crime. Prosecutors were granted broad discretion, and once a juvenile entered adult court, sentencing options were often mandatory and severe. Judges, bound by these laws, had little room to consider age, background, or potential for rehabilitation. Tate's sentence became a clear example of how rigid statutes could produce extreme outcomes. Public reaction was deeply divided. Some believed the sentence was justified, emphasizing accountability and justice for victims. Others viewed it as a moral failure, evidence of a system willing to permanently discard children. Advocacy organizations rallied around the case, filing appeals and pushing for resentencing. International observers also weighed in, noting that the United States stood almost alone among developed nations in sentencing juveniles to life without parole. As appeals moved forward, the case became part of a broader legal movement challenging harsh juvenile sentences nationwide. Courts began hearing arguments that life without parole sentences for minors violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Tate's case was cited repeatedly as an example of how far the system had gone and why reform was urgently needed. The sentence no longer represented just a single case. It symbolized a turning point in how America questioned punishment, responsibility, and redemption for young offenders. What began as a local prosecution was now shaping conversations in legislatures, universities, and courtrooms across the country, setting the stage for historic changes still to come. The legal and social fallout from cases like Lionel Tate eventually reached the highest levels of the American justice system. As appeals continued and public pressure mounted, courts were forced to confront a fundamental question. Should a crime committed in adolescence define a person's entire life? The issue was no longer limited to one defendant. It had become a constitutional debate about punishment, proportionality, and human development. Over the next decade, a series of landmark U.S. Supreme Court decisions reshaped juvenile sentencing nationwide. The court ruled that mandatory life-without-parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, recognizing that children are fundamentally different from adults in terms of maturity, impulse control, and capacity for change. These rulings did not excuse crimes or erase harm, but they required courts to consider age, background, and rehabilitation before imposing the harshest penalties. The justice system was being told, clearly, that youth matters. For individuals already serving life sentences for crimes committed as teenagers, these decisions opened the door to resentencing hearings. Inmates who entered prison as children were now adults, some middle-aged, others elderly, having spent most of their lives behind bars. Courts reviewed their behavior in prison, educational efforts, and psychological evaluations. Some sentences were reduced. Others were upheld. The process was slow and emotionally charged, but it marked a shift away from automatic condemnation toward individualized judgment. The broader impact extended beyond courtrooms. States revised juvenile sentencing laws, eliminated mandatory life sentences for minors, and expanded opportunities for parole review. Prosecutors were required to justify extreme punishments more carefully. Judges were given discretion to weigh growth and rehabilitation. The United States, long criticized internationally for its treatment of juvenile offenders, began moving closer to global human rights standards. Yet the debate did not end. Victims' families continued to argue for accountability and permanence, while reform advocates emphasized redemption and second chances. Communities wrestled with difficult questions. Can someone who committed a violent crime as a teenager truly change? How much weight should time served carry? And who decides when punishment has gone far enough? Cases like From High School to Prison for Life changed America, not because they offered easy answers, but because they forced the nation to ask harder questions. They reshaped laws, challenged assumptions, and redefined how justice views youth. The story is not about forgetting harm. It is about recognizing that childhood, even when marked by terrible actions, should not automatically erase the possibility of a future.